Okay, guys, it's definitely been a few weeks since we did our last report at Carey's Camp, but we're still doing the history of Carey's Camp Road. And we were sort of hoping to be here before now, but life got in the way. We had a couple weddings and other things, but we're here today. And we have a couple people that's going to tell us some more history of Carey's Camp Road. So we're going to walk up this way and tell you the history. So just follow us up here. Now, if you remember last time when we were talking, Mr. Elijah Carey was the one that donated the land for the church. And now we're at the cemetery, and we're going to find out some more history because this is Carey's cemetery. And I don't know if you remember, but last time Mr. Ward was with us, and we also, my son is anything historical that I know, a lot of times he digs it up for us. So him and Don are going to sort of tell us a story about what's going on here. So we'll have to speak up loud so the camera can pick up our voices. So Bryce, do you want to go first or Don?
I guess I'll start. So I believe you just mentioned that we're at Carey Cemetery. This is the cemetery that's attached to Carey's Church and Carey's Camp, where we were earlier this summer. So right here, we are standing in front of what I believe would be the person who donated pretty much the land for Carey's Camp and Carey's Church, and ultimately I believe for the cemetery too. The gentleman's name was Mr. Elijah W. Carey, and he passed away about 1887. Towards the end of his life, he donated the land here for what we have, where we're standing at today. Do you have any more information about anything you want to share about Mr. Carey?
Well, this area where we're standing was a private cemetery for the Carey family. They were pretty well-to-do, and their farm encompassed several hundred acres across the road, around behind Carey's Church, and all in the big field behind me. Toward the end of the 1800s, they started burying people that were not a part of the Carey family, and in 1903 they gave the land, and it was incorporated as Carey Cemetery, and they started selling spaces. And it took them a little over 100 years to sell all the spaces, and of course they're all sold now. My father was involved with keeping a record of who owned which space, and then Oliver Jones took it over after my father passed away, and Oliver gave it to me before he passed away. So I have the plot book and the list of the families, not the individuals, but the families that own the plots. We have never tried to keep a list of individuals and where they're buried. So if an individual is buried and the family doesn't put a stone there, we can always go back to the family and see who owns that space. But if the family is gone or doesn't have a record, we may not know who's buried there. There are some spaces in the cemetery where I don't know who's buried there, what family owns it. That's because over the years, maybe there's been a mistake here or they are made. And I started to sell a plot a few years ago, and I decided I should prod it with a rod, and I found the vault there. So I couldn't sell the space because there was already somebody buried there. But there was nothing in the cemetery records that indicated who was buried there. So all the spaces have been sold for several years now. There's some spaces that were sold to families in the early 1900s that are not filled, but those families for the most part have moved away. So it's not real clear who owns those spaces anymore. They would essentially be owned by an estate of the family, and if somebody wanted to use those spaces, it would be fairly complicated because they would have to get some kind of agreement for the living members of the family, and sometimes the family is all over the place, and that would be difficult to do.
All right, so I got a quick question. So
Sure.
what you're saying is, even though the cemetery has no more plots for sale, it's possible that there's 100 spots here that no one's been buried in, or maybe more.
That's very possible, because there are people that have bought spaces for their family, and they're younger people, and there are nobody buried in those spaces. My father had a plot where he was going to be buried, which is right over there, but while he was still involved with the cemetery, he bought 16 spaces and gave 8 to me and 8 to my sister, and we have given them to our children, so there's nobody buried in any of those. There's 16 right there.
Right.
So I suspect we
But
could
but
easily find more than 100.
But in some cases, there could be some, like you said, where the family may no longer be living, and there's plots that will never be filled because, one, probably nobody even knows about it,
That's right.
or there's nobody around anymore that would want to be buried here.
That's right. Or the family would be so scattered. You
Right.
know, you could have
Right.
20 relatives for somebody that bought a plot in, let's say, 1910. You could easily have 20 relatives living all over the East Coast or the West Coast, and if somebody wanted to use one of those spots, it would be challenging to get enough of those people to sign off to have some kind of legal way to give somebody access,
Sure.
permission to be buried there.
So, did you have anything else, Bryce? I just wanted, first of all, getting back to Mr. Carey. He lived across the road from here, correct?
Yes.
His farm was right behind us.
Yes.
Uh,
About 100 yards right through there was the home place. I grew up in the home place.
You remember the house?
Yep.
You lived in the house?
I did. It was right behind where my sister lives now.
Okay.
The house we think was built in the mid to early 1800s. Post and beam construction. My father built this house in 1954. We moved in 1955. And when he retired, the old house was kind of an eyesore with asbestos shingles, so he tore it down and pretty much burned it up. But it was kind of a classic structure. The post and beam was interesting. Some of the floorboards in there were 22 inches wide. Kind of an interesting house. But yeah, that was the first house, and the entrance. Somebody might find it interesting. The entrance to that house now is right in front of the cemetery. But when that house was built, this road was not here. And the road that was here was Carey's Camp Road. It was a very old road. It went from Salisbury to Georgetown and Millsboro, and the fork for the Georgetown and Millsboro was right at the corner of the Carey's Church property now. But the entrance to this house was a very long driveway, and it was on Carey's Camp, and it came up right through there. I know you can't see this on the video, but it came up parallel to Conway Road. And that road was still there, that entrance was there when I was a child growing up. But over the years, people had stopped using that entrance. And when this road was built, it was much simpler to have the entrance coming here 100 yards away instead of going down there, which must be 300 yards away. And it was a dirt entrance, so it was always a challenge to keep the potholes removed and whatnot.
So, do you want to show us how you would prod a grave for someone?
Sure. If somebody wants to know where somebody is buried, and they know somebody is buried there, now I'm assuming there's a concrete vault here. I don't know that, but we can soon find out.
Yep, that's something. Yep.
The metal tip on concrete has a unique sound. hope somebody could hear that, but that's a vault that we were hitting, and
Does anybody ever knock back?
not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. I've never heard a tapping sound
Okay.
on there. Although somebody might find it interesting, years ago in England, they exhumed a coffin and they found scratch marks on the coffin lid. And of course that was very distressing, because what they realized that they had buried somebody that was alive, and during the pandemic, they had a pandemic, and they felt horrible about that. So they actually started for a while running a string from inside the coffin up to the top and connecting a bell to it, so that if somebody came to life, so to speak, after they were buried, they could ring the bell and somebody could come and dig them out. So,
Guessing they didn't do that here.
no. That was apparently did happen for a little while, but you know, advanced medical procedures, they made sure that somebody had expired before they were buried.
Well, was there anything else you wanted to share with us today about the cemetery, or what you do? You told me it's not a caretaker. You're called a
The word technically is sexton.
sexton.
But it's not a word I really claim, but that's a word is given to somebody who's in charge of the cemetery. The plots were laid off so that they would hold 4 or 5 vaults. And people may find this of interest. And I'm sure somebody's going to say, well, did they hold 4? Did they hold 5? And sometimes I explained that to people when we had some for sale and I was selling them. It depends. They'll hold 5 if people die in the right order. And they think I'm crazy when I say that. But they'll hold 5 if they're buried with minimum space between the vaults. But if somebody dies in space number 1 and the next person is space number 3, and the gravedigger doesn't leave the appropriate space, you cannot get 5 in there. But normally you can get 4 without worrying too much about the inches. So we keep a plot. It's pretty much a master plot for the cemetery, and we can have it cross-referenced with the deed book, so we can tell everybody that ever had a deed for a plot out here. Somebody comes and wants to know where Mrs. Jones is buried. We do not keep that record, but I can tell somebody where Mrs. Jones' family plot was, because we have a plot and we have a record of when they had a deed. On occasion, we have people come and say, well, I think my grandfather's buried out there, can you help me? And sometimes I cannot, because they know the name of the grandfather, but it doesn't correspond to anything on my reference for people that have bought lots. Of course, last names, you know, don't always indicate family. You can have somebody buried with a different last name in a family plot.
Right.
I know of cases where people have died and didn't have a plot and were really worried about what's going to happen to me. And somebody else would say, we have an extra space on our plot and you can be buried there. No relation whatsoever, but a good friend, a charity kind of situation.
So has anybody ever been buried in the wrong spot?
Yes.
And what did they do? I mean, how did they figure it out?
Well, I know of one case where somebody was buried across a line, only because the cemetery or the undertaker and the gravedigger didn't come and ask. All of a sudden, we come down here and we find that here's a vault, and it's actually across the property line, so to speak. So the person that has half a vault that he has no idea what family it is, it's in his. So the vault company had to come and move it, and we kind of discussed who was going to pay for that.
I bet, yeah.
But it wasn't, it's not our fault if you don't ask us. So we get all kinds of questions sometimes from people. But the one thing I would really like to stress is that we never decide where somebody is going to be buried. We will show the family, or we'll show the undertaker or the grave digger the spaces that they own. But as far as whether somebody should be buried in space 1, 2, 3, or 4, that's not a job of the sexton or anybody connected with the cemetery. That's a job for the family. And families are sensitive about, where they're going to be buried, and I understand that. I feel the same way.
Who's going to be buried next to Pop?
Exactly. And we have gotten into some situations where there were bigger families and somebody wanted to be buried in a certain place and wanted me to decide that it was okay. And I said, absolutely not. There's a liability situation there. And the cemetery doesn't particularly want to be paying for mistakes that I make. And so we'll identify the space, and I can show them the corners, and we can prod and see how many vaults are there and what spaces are available, and the family can decide, where they want them. But that's a misunderstanding sometimes, even with funeral homes. They think we're going to decide where they're going to be buried, and under no circumstances are we going to decide where they're going to be buried. It's a family responsibility, and the family needs to decide that.
Well,
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
More of a historical question, really. From what you know of the cemetery as a sexton of it, who do you think? And I know it's a hard, not the easiest question to ask, because it's not a big cemetery by comparison to the local area. But who do you think would be the most famous person buried in this cemetery? Contributions to the local area, or maybe even to a bigger stage. Who would you think would be most well known?
Wow, I've not thought about that.
Do you have someone in mind?
I don't. Not really. I don't think there's any. I'm not aware of any politicians or any person buried here. It's a lot of just local families of the area, it seems.
Yeah, it's pretty much local families. Raymond West is buried here. He was a local politician, state representative. But perhaps the best known person buried here would be Joe Ben Hudson. Joseph Benjamin Hudson was, when he died, I believe he was 108 years old, had lived in the community all his life, and he's buried here. I knew, we always called him Joe Ben, that's what he wanted to be called. He went to church every Sunday, and I knew him quite well and used to love to talk with him. His father, I believe, is buried here. He was 101 when he died, and he died, I believe, in the 1950s. And the thing I remember, of course, I lived up here in the 1950s, but I remember people saying, we have never seen anybody or heard of anybody that lived to be 100 years old. In the 1950s, that was just something that never happened. And then it was maybe 20-some years later that Joe Ben lived to be 108. And a lot of people knew him, knew about him, and he had he was a little bit famous among the people that lived around here, because they knew him, knew where he lived. And I don't know anybody else of any significant fame.
All right, well, we're going to wrap this up. I'm hoping the volume's enough you can hear, because a lot of traffic you can tell going by. But we have some more places on Carey's Camp Road we would like to share the history of that we know in some future dates, and I'm dare not going to say how soon that'll be, because sometimes things don't work out like we think. But we've got some very interesting things coming up that I think a lot of people would like to hear about. So anyway, signing off for now. It's a couple weeks before Christmas 2022, and thanks again. And Don, I'm sure we got a couple more spots we're going to drag you along with us if you'll come.
Be happy to share what I know.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Bryce.
Yep.
Okay, Matt. Oh, I didn't give you credit. Did you get it?